Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to this session of the World Sustainable Procurement Day. My name is Anthony Fuller, and together with my co-chair, Augustina Cadonius, I head up the USA chapter of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. Today, we've got what I think is probably the most current and relevant topic of all, which is what the future looks like for sustainable procurement here in the United States, the world's largest market. It's going to be a very informative 45 minutes or so as we look into the structure of government here, which actors will be driving sustainability policy and action in the coming years, and of course, what this means for sustainable procurement practitioners. No matter where you are in the world, this topic definitely affects you. I think everyone by now is probably aware of the usual housekeeping rules from earlier sessions on WSPD. However, just a reminder, please feel free to use the Q&A button. We'll do our best to address any questions that come up during the course of the session. With that said, let me now introduce our two guest speakers. Today, we're joined by John Kostyack, who is founder and principal at Kostyack Strategies, a consultancy that helps NGOs and foundations to achieve their climate change and clean energy policy goals. His experience stretches over 3 decades in executive leadership at national nonprofits, managing policy advocacy campaigns, and representing nonprofit and private sector clients in federal and state courts. Currently, he focuses on helping clients to design and execute policy campaigns aimed at reducing climate-related financial risk and reorienting private and public finance toward deployment of low-carbon technologies. So welcome, John. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Anthony.
And along with John, we're also happy to invite Professor Stephen Schooner, who is the Jeffrey and Martha Cohen Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and the Nash and Kabinick Professor of Government Procurement Law at George Washington University Law School. Before joining the faculty, Professor Schooner was the Associate Administrator for Procurement Law and Legislation at the U.S. Office of Federal Procurement Policy. He previously served at the Department of Justice within private law firms as a commissioner at the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals. As an Army Reserve officer, he taught for many years at the Judge Advocate General's School of the Army in Charlottesville, Virginia. Outside of the U.S., Professor Schooner has advised government officials on public procurement issues, whether directly or through multi-government initiatives in more than 40 countries. So Professor Schooner, thank you also for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for including me.
Excellent. So we've got a lot we want to cover today. So why don't we jump straight into the panel discussion? A number of questions I'd like to bring up today, which hopefully will help us gain a better understanding of the structure of government here in the US, the different levels of actors that we have, and what the future may look like for procurement, especially sustainable procurement in the United States. So maybe we can start with just that. I'll turn to you, Professor Schooner, first. Can you help us understand what role US federal government procurement plays in the US economy?
Well, as someone who works in Washington, D.C., and as someone who came from the federal government, I always would like to think that it's incredibly important. But in this context, it may actually be much less important than many think. I expect in just a few moments, we'll actually even be able to show you some graphics that demonstrate that it's not as big as you want. But realistically, we have a federal government. The federal government does many things that are very important, but there's a lot of action that happens at the states as well. And again, I'll come back to that. But there's also an interesting historical perspective on this, in that in many people's minds, advocates and critics, the federal government normally took a very significant leadership role in public procurement. Many public procurement regimes around the world modeled much of their design based on things that we had done in the United States. And for many people who are familiar with things like, for example, the space program, they think of the government as the ones that were doing the innovation, the ones who are often leading markets or creating markets. The reality is that's not necessarily the case anymore. So on the one hand, the government's role is significantly less. And in many ways, there's also another story that's relevant here, and that is that the biggest chunk of federal procurement in the United States is defense. And as many people in this program would recognize, the United States Defense Department is probably the single largest institutional carbon emitter anywhere on the planet. To the extent that the slides are up now, I'll just very, very briefly mention, again, the federal government represents the entire nation. Under that, we have 50 states of wildly different sizes, many of which are much larger than many countries around the world. And then there's an incredible number of smaller government instrumentalities. And we can break this down a little bit more as well. But I'll go ahead and let John jump in before I keep rambling.
Thank you, Steve. That's great background and a great way to look at this issue. So we don't need to be quite so frightened. I'll say a few things that are less positive. The way I look at procurement out of the federal government, world's largest customer, what it does is really important because not just because it helps address the programs and services delivered by the federal government, but it sends really strong market signals around the world. So we have been making very good progress on sustainable procurement, both at the product level and the company level. I had a really important update to sustainable products rules that we managed to get across the finish line during the Biden administration, and almost got through a company level supplier climate risk disclosure rule. And I think I can safely say the plug was pulled once they realized they couldn't get it done, and the election happened, and it was clear we're going to have a significant change of direction. To simplify where we're at now is the incoming administration has pulled back anything that relates to climate, anything that relates to diversity across virtually all programs. And that involves program cuts, funding cuts, and regulatory retreat. So I think it's going to pose some challenges. I know in today's call, we're going to get into the state level, and I have a great optimism. One of the great things about the U.S. is we're a federalist system. And when the federal government stops moving on things, you can make up the ground at the state level. In that sense, I'm optimistic. But my main news is at the federal level, we've had some pretty significant cutbacks on programs, as well as retreats by those independent agencies that make sure that markets function efficiently and fairly. So I'll leave that at the high level comment and happy to elaborate on that.
And if I could just jump in for a moment, since John mentioned that in many sectors, we're the world's largest customer, I'll just put a number on it. For the last few years, we've spent more than $700 billion a year just in federal procurement. And again, we can show you later, we actually spend every bit as much of that at the state and local level. But the federal government as a unitary buyer, $700 billion a year. Now, interestingly enough, for those of you in other countries, if you want to do compare and contrast, that number tends to include what we call goods, services, and construction. And as many of you know, what we often refer to as construction is referred to in other countries as works or public works. It's actually been fascinating just in our professional lifetime. When I started in this business, the government primarily bought goods. But now, like most countries around the world where it's outsourced, much more of that takes place with regard to services. But all of the points that John made are incredibly important. We'll come back to some of those later, but to the extent that you have the other slide in front of you, one of the things that you can see is the dramatic distribution of spending across the country. And again, as many of you know, the spending doesn't correlate to the geographical size of the state. But the other thing that's deceptive about some of these things is in the United States, we also have a number of regional authorities. So for those of you who have traveled in and out of New York, there's the New York Port Authority, larger than the procurement system of many countries around the world. Here in Washington, D.C., we have both an airport authority and a local transportation authority, what we call WMATA. But there's all kinds of different instrumentalities there. So we're talking cumulatively lots of really, really big numbers.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that background. Let's stay on the federal level for a moment before we move on to the state level. Let's, as John raised the question there about some of the changes taking place, can you help us understand what's happening with the new administration? What do you think the ultimate intentions are for ESG topics, and how does that affect procurement policy in the US?
Well, it's a strange thing because we have two opposite signals being sent right now. When it comes to markets, we've been hearing almost nothing but good news lately. Renewable energy combined with storage and demand response is outcompeting fossil sources of energy right now. and electricity markets, it's not even a close call. And so the federal government was taking advantage of those savings and also was helping to bolster that growing clean energy economy until very recently. And there's still hope that we can keep a lot of the key tax incentives we've got a few years ago with the Inflation Reduction Act in place. That will be decided in the upcoming budget reconciliation bill. And so one of my key messages here today, if you're working for a company or an investor, this matters a lot for creating a stable investing environment, and anything sustainability related, you should be engaging. The other thing that's happening is that Congress is really backing off its usual role. And so we've had a number of dramatic things happening, but two that specifically relate to what I would call climate risk management, management of visibility into climate-related economic opportunities. And one that I want to start with is science. We've had pretty dramatic cutbacks on basic monitoring of what's going on with our climate, what's going on with our environment, as well as the more in-depth research capacities that happen at our university system. And so that matters a lot if you care about designing your business strategy to basically reflect reality on the ground of climate risk, extreme weather events, as well as the reality on the ground in terms of the global transition toward a decarbonized economy. To me, any business that is aware and not in denial of climate change is on top of those two gigantic issues and adapting their company strategy to that. And that becomes more difficult when one of the chief sources of data is exiting. Major data sets are suddenly going to go dark that the modelers have been relying upon. NOAA is facing dramatic cutbacks. Anything related to climate at NOAA is being cut out. So that's one of the big threats. The other one I'm really worried about is the independent agencies. So Congress, in its wisdom over the past 80 years, has passed a series of laws to say when we're dealing with competitive markets, we don't think that agency should be the subject of White House interference and control, because it sets us up for crony capitalism. And anybody who shows up the White House with their large donations gets favoritism in these markets. We don't need that. That's not good for sustainability. It's not good for a whole host of other social goals. You want efficient markets. You want a Federal Trade Commission and a Securities and Exchange Commission, a Federal Reserve. All these agencies, the financial agencies, are designed to be independent of the White House. Well, we now have an executive order that says that this administration doesn't believe that. That will eventually be litigated. But key people are being fired as we speak. The FTC over the past week lost 2 commissioners. And that's the place where we try to ensure that we're fighting back monopoly practices and fraudulent practices in the market. We've had problems with other regulators as well. So these are 2 big areas, I think, for anybody who cares about sustainable procurement, to try to ensure you're competing in a fair marketplace and you can highlight all your progress. It gets more difficult in that environment.
Yeah.
So I guess I want to always leave with an action message. Companies and investors, you have a lot at stake here. You should be engaging with your federal government right now, your members of Congress. They should be involved in this conversation and not stepping back.
Steve?
Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my professor hat back on for a minute and just step back and do some basics, but I'm agreeing with everything John's saying. So first, when we talk about what's happening now, I like rubrics. And generally, we think about 4 different things when we talk about where procurement is going in the United States: legislation, regulation, policy, and practice. What's happened, and remember, we're only a few months into a new administration, and arguably you could say we're really only 2 months into the real meat of it. But what we see on those 4, legislation, regulation, policy, and practice, John's already alluded to this. Let me do them out of order. In terms of practice, one of the most, shall we say, destabilizing thing that's happening right now is the incoming administration has stopped entirely and, in effect, either threatened or suggested that they're going to, in effect, derail a lot of existing contracts and slow down contracts that are being awarded. So the normal flow, the normal cycle has been interrupted. And in some areas, probably the most dramatic example would be international aid, the United States Agency for International Development. There was a complete freeze, now which is being lifted again, but the practical part, that's been destabilized. The policy aspect is normally where we start, and that's kind of been a black hole. So we know that the incoming administration wants to change things, and as an observer, it feels like they often want to break things. But we haven't even begun the policy discussion that normally precedes our process as to how we get to legislation and regulation. John already spoke about the elephant in the room. The way that we structure federal procurement in the United States is everything begins and ends with our legislature. Congress makes the rules, Congress appropriates the money. No money, no procurement. No rules, no authority. And as John said, Congress is completely, in effect, removed themselves from what's happening while the administration is churning. The last one that's important is we have a very well-established, complicated, but familiar regulatory structure. Our primary regulations are called the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. It's massive. It's consistent. Everybody knows it. But there's a couple things John mentioned earlier. In the prior administration, for the purposes of this audience, we were focused on two major rules. The timing of them became a little confusing, but what happened towards the end of the administration is we reorganized our primary rule on sustainable procurement. So we had a little bit of housekeeping, we had a lot of cleanup, a lot of modernization, and a lot of that particularly had to do with how we buy products, particularly with regard to eco labels and standards. Conversely, the rule where everybody put the most energy into it, that was what we often called either the responsibility rule, or you might think of as primarily the disclosure rule. So if you think about the greenhouse gas protocol and the fact that we expect institutions to basically account for, report on, and target reductions in emissions, that was the rule that was basically saying, if you want to compete for a government contract, you're going to have to account, disclose, and target. And as John was saying, that rule's now gone at this point. So now we're looking more to the private sector for firms to self-identify as to what they're doing in this regard. But there's currently no real discussion of what the federal government's doing with regard to any of these things. So again, very, very confusing, lots of things moving quickly. And there's also some internal rumors that suggest what the administration would like to do is something that's antithetical to what we've done for generations. And that would be to consolidate all procurement expertise in a single agency. Historically, in the United States, the agencies that have the authority to conduct missions have the authority to conduct procurement, and so they buy for themselves. There's a lot of discussion that the administration wants to move everything to our General Services Administration, which started out primarily as our offices and our supply organization. But I've been rambling for a minute. I'll stop there.
Now, this is great. So I just want to pick up on something that that you both mentioned in the course of the last few minutes. So I think most people will know that the SEC had proposed a rule on climate disclosure, which actually was a subject of multiple lawsuits and then was eventually pulled altogether. And I think I'm right in saying that even before that happened, the SEC's ESG team had already been disbanded. So given that to speak on behalf of the cynics for a second, progress had been quite slow in some of these areas. Practically, what difference does it make now if the new administration, for example, does bring some of these agencies under closer executive control?
Go ahead, John.
Well, I'll go first. Steve, and I worked a lot on that SEC rule as well as the parallel rule that the procurement agency were working on. And they both were based upon the premise that the market benefits from a standardized approach for climate risk disclosure. That's not going away. That's the good news. I'm not all bad news today. I'm going to tell you that is alive and well, not in the federal government, but because regulators around the globe are making great efforts to standardize. We are going to soon have a standardized global system for disclosing what companies are doing to manage their climate risks. By the way, I know there's a bunch of other ESG issues and I can touch on them, but let me just go down a little bit further down the road on climate. So yes, the federal government completely absenting itself from the field, but we have California, already has passed two major pieces of legislation, and they are now moving in the rulemaking phase. They will adopt the global framework of the GHG protocol for emissions disclosures and the ISSB framework for climate risk disclosures. Similarly, that's happening in 30 countries around the world are adopting the ISSB framework as we speak. And then we have the EU putting together a very similar framework with the CSRD. So we have a mandatory framework that's coming into place. And in general, it is harmonized around all these jurisdictions. That helps countries get a little bit of visibility into what kind of information they need to be gathering. And we're here on a procurement talk. Most of the climate risk is in the supply chains. And most of the opportunities are in the supply chains for really capturing the business opportunities around the transition to a decarbonized economy and resilience building for climate impacts. So I think this is nothing but good news on this climate disclosure thing, that's still on a very positive track, despite the SEC's pullback.
Sure.
We could talk about ESG investing more broadly, but I've spoken enough and I want to hear what Steve has to say.
Yeah, sure.
I think there's one other interesting thing that this group might be interested in, and that is before the SEC pulled back and during the multi-year period when our federal government was considering what we often call the responsibility or the disclosure rule for contractors, one of the things that came up was validation. And there were many of us who thought that when the United States created this rule, the rule should have some kind of quality control. So it wouldn't be enough to say, I file an annual report that says, I am a despoiler of the universe and I've complied with my requirements. Or if I say, I have no scope 3 emissions or no scope 2 emissions because everything I do is squeaky clean. And that's why the original draft rule had incorporated some kind of external validation, and they had pointed to primarily the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative. It was a very interesting political moment, however, because in terms of organizing the opposition, particularly in the defense community, one of the things that you often heard from the critics was, oh, we can't have non-American instrumentalities telling us who's qualified to do United States contracts. Mm-hmm. There wasn't any suggestion that we should come up with our own independent organization with similar skills and similar aspirations to SBTI, but there was a fair amount of pushback. The other one I'll just mention before I wrap up here on the SBTI was that I think many of you know, SBTI doesn't have to work with and doesn't agree to work with everyone. And so if you are going to have an independent organization, someone who basically says, I don't believe in this kind of stuff, there's no reason to think that SBTI, who makes voluntary choices, is going to be your sole solution. But for many of us, the SBTI anecdote was kind of an interesting political moment in terms of how to attack these types of regulations.
Great. Yeah, I think SBTI is a whole topic by itself. Let's thank you for the overview of what's happening at the federal level. I think that's really critical for people to hear about. Let's move on to talk about states, because I think especially for people not living in the United States, they may not be aware of the significance of what happens at the sub-federal level. So maybe let's start with that question. Maybe you can both help us understand the role of the states, especially in setting sustainability policy.
Steve, you want to go first?
Let me just briefly say, as I suggested earlier, and you saw the graphics, look, 50 states. Some of the states are massive. Some of the cities within the states are massive. You've already heard us mention California, which is large geographically, large economically, and does all of the things that many of us would like in terms of sustainable procurement. And they have what is often seen as one of the stronger procurement systems in the United States. Mm-hmm. But we can all come up with our list of the states that are ahead of the curve. I often point people in the direction of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maryland as well. But there are plenty of individual states doing some really good things with regard to sustainable procurement. Of course, remember, once we're at the state level, they tend to buy different things. And so their expenditure or their spend correlates to different priorities. But particularly for those of you in Europe, keep in mind that when we're having a conversation about procurement, when we talk about federal procurement policy, this is not like the EU, where the federal government is mandating basic policies for all 50 states. The 50 states are doing all kinds of different things, and some are far more aggressive than others. For those of you that follow generally or at a high level news in the United States, you'll hear people talk about red states and blue states. The blue states tend to be a little bit more advanced on this, not just with regard to the climate change related issue, but on many of the other things that we would think about if we were talking about the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So whether it's equity or diversity or gender or education, the metrics are going to look very different in the blue states than the red states. But again, if we were to go back 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years, where John and I would have begun is, as the Biden administration came in and they were getting invested in sustainable procurement, the federal government was behind the states then and looking for models to catch up. Now, once again, we're going to be focused more on what the states are doing because we expect the federal government to do a little bit less. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so perhaps we can put up a map of the states with clean, climate action plans, because that gives, yeah, there you go. I mean, we have a lot of states in our country that are not in climate denial and are moving forward. And so there's just enormous opportunities. We have a provision of our Constitution that's called federal preemption. So if a state directly steps into a field already occupied by the federal government, they really can't act. But in general, they have a lot of running room. And especially when it comes to procurement, states have a ton of running room. So virtually every one of these states that has a clean energy goal is an enormous business opportunity for companies that are specializing in sustainable products and sustainability and company-wide sustainability. Because, and by the way, I should say, I have the great pleasure of working for Ceres, the Boston-based NGO. And we've been going around from state to state talking about procurement. And most states are still early days in taking sort of the modern concepts we've been talking about here today, about sort of company-wide management of climate risks and opportunities and integrating into the procurement decisions. So it's just world of opportunities. But you know, every one of those clean energy plans for the states makes a brief reference to procurement, and it all needs to be filled out. The details still need to come. Now there are exceptions. So California is an early adopter and fifth largest market in the world. So what I was saying before about the U.S. applies equally to California. You can help decarbonize California supply chains. You can help make those supply chains more resilient, and you can send a market signal to the world about where markets are heading. So just enormous opportunity. And the good news I have is just in a week or two ago, Senator Blakespear introduced a climate procurement bill to match the two existing laws on climate disclosure and basically calling for disclosure by the largest companies in doing business with the state. I think it's about 500 companies, anyone with doing more than 5 million or more per year. Yep. So things are moving on procurement. I'm expecting more to be popping in the states on climate and procurement as we go forward. But this would be the logical place to start. These are the states that have already made the commitment. We are moving forward. We are looking at every single opportunity to decarbonize and to build resilience. And people with ideas and business opportunities and want to do business with the state, if you've got those kind of products and services, you should be talking to them. And, you know, hopefully working together with us on moving policy to send the right signals.
I think this, sorry, John, I think that the map on screen is very, very interesting because this is showing the states that have declared clean energy goals. Interestingly, for example, Texas is not colored there, and yet there are days when Texas gets more than 80% of its electricity from renewable sources. So there's also that kind of the plummeting cost of solar energy in particular, which is creating an economic incentive. So what are your thoughts about the economics alone helping some of these other states catch up?
Great question. And actually, maybe that's a good segue to the next map. And because what you have found when we pass those big tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act is that a lot of manufacturing started hitting the ground. It's a really exciting moment in this country's history because it's been a while since we've had a manufacturing renaissance. And look where a lot of those manufacturing facilities ended. A lot of them ended up in Texas and other states that have access to cheap renewable energy. Texas is a powerhouse renewable energy producer because it has created a market system and has built energy market, electricity markets, and a transmission system that is very friendly to whatever energy source can compete effectively in the markets. It's a very competitive market. So you put that next to these subsidies for clean manufacturing and some subsidy tax credits to give some certainty for solar and wind and battery storage. And we've been going gangbusters. I mean, I'm not going to roll out all the numbers. I'm just going to tell you that the progress we've made on building a clean energy economy in the past several years is just really exciting. I expect that to continue, not at quite the same pace. A lot rides on whether or not these IRA incentives get wiped out or substantially cut in the upcoming budget reconciliation. But the market forces are powerful. Politics will stand in the way sometimes on market forces, and so that's why we all need to stay engaged.
And if I could just jump in on a couple things here, look, the map is incredibly powerful, and what you see on there is the different categories. Solar, John mentioned it. The volume is going up, the price is coming down, but it also shows you some of the quirky things about our government. So we've had 36 panels put on our roof literally less than 2 years ago. And in so doing, John mentioned the statutory structure. We received a significant federal tax credit for that. And that was a wonderful thing. Recently, I engaged with my local municipality, which is going to have a much, much smaller credit that will also be rolled out over a number of years. And then in addition, when I get my utility bill on a regular basis, periodically the state gives me credits based on the excess electricity that I'm producing that goes back into the state-run utility that somehow turns into small tradable units, which are very, very small. But it's interesting to see the three of these are happening independently. The other thing that's been fascinating is I do think that, for example, the wind development has been more or better correlated to where the wind is rather than the orientations of the states, which again goes to John's point, it being a very positive issue. I think one of the most negative issues that we're dealing with, if you were to look ahead, and one that's going to be interesting to see what we do with in the future, is what we do about water. And if you ever want to read about something that's really dramatically impacting one segment of the United States, the Colorado River, and particularly everything that flows into the Hoover Dam, is a massive area where there isn't enough water. All of the projections are broken. And frankly, we don't have a very good plan for what we're going to do about it in the future. But as the water levels drop, obviously one of the other things that happens is we lose that hydroelectricity as well. But while we're on this and this is in front of us, do you want to say some more about the IRA? Because I think one of the things that is important here is to go back to one of the points that John made earlier. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the most significant advances in this country in investing in almost everything that's relevant, is an act of our legislature. The money that funds those initiatives is driven by the legislature. Many of those initiatives come through tax incentives, which is dealt with by the Internal Revenue Service. The question is how all of this pays out in the future. The current administration and the current head of the Environmental Protection Agency cannot unilaterally make the statute go away. But they can interrupt what's happening at our Internal Revenue Service, and they can, to some extent, disrupt the funding procedures. But at least for right now, one thing that they haven't interrupted so far are all of these wonderful things that have kind of led to this resurgence in the United States. Thoughts, John?
Yeah, I mean, there are exceptions. The offshore wind is taking a bruising right now, despite the fact that they were counting on those tax credits, because let's face it, the administration has a lot of power of what happens on federal lands and waters. And so it's just an ideological hostility to offshore wind or to wind in general, which makes no sense to me. I used to run a wind energy foundation. I could tell you, I could go on up and down about all the economic benefits that wind delivers and how it's so critical for decarbonizing our economy. So Yes, we're going to need Congress to decide about the future of the Inflation Reduction Act. And what's really interesting about the politics in our country, interesting, sad. Sad is we have climate is no longer a conversation about science and how do we protect communities. It's become ideological and a cultural warfare thing. So that could make you really pessimistic about the future of the signature climate law, the most powerful climate law ever passed in the world. That said, there are Republicans that are stepping forward to defend this law because it is truly revitalizing business in their districts.
Yeah.
So we have already started to get proof on the ground. It's early days. If we had another 10 years, this wouldn't even be a debate, but early days showing the enormous economic benefits of shifting to a decarbonized economy. And frontline districts that are seeing the earliest benefits typically are Republican. And so it's going to be really critical, especially for companies and investors that have relationships with Republican offices, especially those that are already receiving some of these economic benefits of these battery manufacturing plants, the EV plants, the wind and solar sites, and beyond, to be in this conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
And to the extent that John said something optimistic, I'd love to do the same. One interesting thing about all this, while there's all this bad news at the federal level, one thing that we've learned over the years with regard to state procurement in the United States is that state procurement officials are in some ways a community of themselves across states. So, for example, we have an organization called NASPO, NASPO, the National Association of State Procurement Officials. They talk to each other. And so one of the things that we've seen when there are new technologies or new innovations, couple of states try it, they kind of like it, and then everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon. And so we kind of expect, as states see greater revenues or savings from their renewable energy projects, that they're going to be saying to their partners in other states, this has worked out really well for us. And we may see some, shall we say, positive contagion in that regard.
Yeah, that's great. So we've got just about 5 or 6 or 7 minutes left. I just got a quick reminder to the audience, any questions you want to ask, please put them into the chat. I'm going to try to get them towards the end. But as we just moved on talking about the incentives to private sector, let's bring up a slightly different sustainability topic or ESG topic. We talked a lot about decarbonization, but one other thing that's been very visible to the public is the question of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we've seen a variety of reactions from large corporations. Now, some of them actually have remained committed to their DEI statements and philosophy. Can you maybe give us some insight into why some of those companies were able to do that and why others, for example, were less willing to maintain their DEI commitments?
Yeah, and actually, I would like to give an answer. It's very similar to the one I gave on climate. I mean, certainly there's a moral and ethical dimension of this we can get into, but we're talking to a business audience here today. So I'm going to make the business case. The same thing that I would say about climate risk, which is don't be distracted by one government's pronouncements, which are highly ideological, and look globally, look at the states, look at all the other key players, market actors, and everyone is saying that a more diverse workforce and fighting discrimination is central to any effective business strategy. And so I think you sit on the sidelines in this one, I think you're going to live to regret it. I think this is a key moment for businesses and investors to step up and speak out in favor of diversity and for more and make the business case. And I think there's plenty of literature out there you could find to support that argument.
Yeah, and I think one other thing, and this is one of the things that's a little bit confusing about it, but John mentioned earlier that we are living through a period in the United States, somewhat unusual, where words are being identified and, in effect, banned. Okay? So the new administration is scrubbing web pages and picking up words like diversity. And, whether words like inclusion also get swept up in that, you'll see different kinds of lists going around. But it is interesting, the people that run organizations, particularly large corporations, aren't necessarily stupid. And it is possible to remove certain words from your webpage and still do the right thing. But it's hard to imagine successful corporations that don't want to take advantage of the full capacity of the population and that don't want to live in the kind of world that most of us would tend to prefer, But I also want to take a half step back and say something that may seem counterintuitive. In the United States, it's very unusual to walk into a policy discussion and hear people talking about the UN SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, whereas our experience is when we go elsewhere around the country, that's your starting point. But in federal procurement, which we've been talking about, what feels like we're moving backwards right now, in many ways, most of the things in the UN SDGs were already in our federal procurement process. It was equal opportunity. There was no discrimination. It was minimum wages. It was worker safety. So in many ways, we were in effect further along on that. And it'll be interesting to see, unlike issues related to climate change, which we're not supposed to talk about, it'll be interesting to see how well we can hold the line on those issues. But it is a very, very confusing time. I would like to say one more thing. I saw a question about it earlier with regard to nuclear. It does seem like possibly in this administration, we're going to see a little bit of more friendliness towards nuclear. And, to some extent, I think this poses one of the biggest challenges for what we often think of as the conventional green community, because in many ways, the nuclear energy is a pretty effective way to deal with many of our short-term crises, and the risks tend to be, at least objectively, somewhat lesser and probably using today's technology better controlled. So it would not surprise me if, in addition to our more conventional renewables, we see a little bit of an acceleration with regard to nuclear, at least in the United States.
Yeah, very good.
Well, I saw a question on the nuclear in the chat. By the way, this is great. I wish I just opened the Q&As. My apologies. I've been so distracted by our conversation. Some really good questions there. So I do think I worry about the EU backing off on the omnibus. So people who in the EU need to be strong on keeping their governments moving forward on sustainability. But on nuclear, the way I look at nuclear, my views have evolved over the years. I think, if it's going to deliver large quantities of carbon-free electricity, we should not be turning it down. That said, always seems to be 10 years away. These plants, especially in the U.S., take forever to get online. They always have cost overruns. They haven't resolved the waste issues. So I don't want to put too many eggs in that basket. We have a ton of cheap wind and solar and geothermal, enhanced geothermal is getting ready to come on in a big way. Let's move fast on the proven technologies. They're ready to go. The only thing that's holding them up is politics. They're jammed up in these interconnection queues at the transmission operators. That's a solvable problem that can be solved like that. So, go ahead if you want to make the big, expensive investments in a nuclear plant. Be careful about that money because more cost overruns are coming. Meantime, we've got a lot of cheap renewables sitting out there waiting to be deployed.
Yep, great. In the last couple of minutes that we have, let's turn our attention now to the sustainable procurement practitioners, the people working, whether it's in public sector or private sector, who've been focused on sustainable sourcing and working with suppliers on decarbonization targets and similar. What's your advice for those individuals, taking into account that at this time they probably have a different perspective than maybe 6 months ago? What's your guidance to them for the coming months and years?
Well, I have a couple, and so I'll say two separate things, possibly inconsistently. First, as someone who consistently finds themselves gravitating towards the doom side of the spectrum rather than the hope side of the spectrum, there is reason for optimism. And I think the biggest reason for optimism is study after study in the United States shows that the public better understands climate change. They better understand not only the need to adapt, but that we need to invest in mitigation. And they want the government to be responsible to help them create a livable world for their children. So I believe that in the story arc, it's going in a much better direction in the United States. And we'll have to see how the disinformation bubble plays out. The other thing that I do want to mention is that familiarity also makes it easier for us to talk about what we often talk about in the United States is the tyranny of low prices, or in other words, that the only reason to invest in something other than a low price solution is that it'll save you money in the long run. We often think of this as life cycle cost analysis. But I do think the discussion is becoming a little bit more sophisticated. about understanding the externalities of climate change. And that's everything from dramatic storms to heat to fires and flood. And frankly, I think that globally, more people are coming to understand that as climate change accelerates, and as we see more famine and drought, that will lead to more emigration, which will lead to regional instability, which will lead to war. And maybe these kinds of larger issues are the things that will make people think more seriously about the things that we actually have to do in the future to have a more livable future.
I know we're down to the last couple of minutes, so I'll be very concise. I want to say two big words: homework and teamwork. There is a lot of homework. This is complex stuff, but we really at this key critical moment need business and investment professionals to be in the conversation about fundamental questions about where we want our businesses and economies to go. And to me, decarbonization and resilience to climate change are the two things that we have the powerful business case. We just need people who are smart, who do their homework, who can articulate it within their companies and then step outside their companies. This is where the teamwork comes in. There has been some pushback on some collaborative efforts using bogus antitrust arguments. And I can't tell you how important it is, considering my challenging world to try to understand these issues, to have people inside my client organizations, but also networks of people inside companies, NGOs, foundations, investor groups that actually sit down and solve problems together. We cannot afford to stop doing that. That is really key to this work, cross-disciplinary teamwork. So I think right now, do not let some of that pushback slow you down. Figure out what alliances are going to be most powerful and what work best for you and your company, and get involved, especially on policy.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Such a positive
maybe
message.
One quick one. I saw there was a question, I think from an Eric Pedersen. There are a number of NGOs and independent organizations that are trying to capture the websites that the government is taking down. They're doing so with mixed results. But I do think that there are people who are more prepared this time, and that they're doing a pretty good job capturing a lot of the information and then repackaging and republishing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are out of time. I want to say a profound thank you to both Steve and John for today. It's been absolutely fantastic conversation. I think it's been a nuanced but also information-rich discussion, which I hope has given everybody a much better perspective on what's happening here in the US. There's definitely reasons for optimism and many different levels at which we can operate no matter what goes on here. Thank you very much for your time today. And to all our participants as well online, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to sign up to SPP at spp.earth and find us on LinkedIn. And with that, thank you to you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the invite.
The world of sustainability is evolving at a very rapid pace. In such a fast-changing environment, it is very important for us to understand that where we stand in terms of all of the different topics pertaining to sustainability. Hence, we are very much focused in order to ensure that our data streams and the information that we have about our supply chain is up to date, is best in class, and is able to help us chart a future for a better tomorrow.
Hi, my name is Noli Mangolele. I'm the head of procurement in SSA. Given our supplier relationships, procurement advocates for suppliers to have clear sustainability roadmaps, to adopt sustainable practices in their own value chain, and to also share best practices with their peers. In that way, we accelerate progress.
Cascading our value of do the right thing into our supply chain gives us the opportunity to drive positive impact with our suppliers.
Procurement is a powerful lever for change because it influences the entire supply chain through eco-friendly supply selection, optimizing resource use, and promoting ethical standards.
Our sustainable procurement practices demonstrate truly inclusive values by considering all stakeholders and build impulse trust relationships with our suppliers.